and that's the signal that we just click the record button so that we will be. Okay, so hello and good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second day of this Planetary Web of Life, and Dr. Radha Gopalan is with us. Yesterday, she has presented this systems view, which was well appreciated and taken by the participants. There were also a plethora of questions that she has answered. Hopefully, the same engagement is going to continue. And on behalf of Lamakan, I welcome Dr. Radha Gopalan to the second day's lecture. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah, so without further ado, I'm going to hand over the stage to her. So she's going to speak on the second day. The topic is our food web. It's over to you.
Thank you. All right, so it's lovely to see all of you back again, several of you from yesterday. So let's sort of take off from where we stopped yesterday. And for those of you who are joining today, we just laid out a framework, and like I said yesterday, this is not so much, sort of me giving a lecture in as much as I'm just attempting to put out some ideas, some questions, and for us to think about it collectively, right? And to really sort of look at this whole issue of, whether it is any of the planetary challenges that we're facing today and have been facing for a while, can we begin to look at it a little differently? Because clearly what we've been doing for so long has led us to where we are today, right? So yesterday we talked about, looking at this web of life from a systems perspective, and really more so from an ecosystems perspective, which means we're looking at it, with the view of understanding it through patterns, networks of relationships, has led us to where we are today, right? Organization. So yesterday we talked about and really trying to see how this very complex from a systems perspective, and really relationship that exists in nature perspective, and human beings being an integral part of that. How can we understand its challenges that we're facing by looking at it through this web of life, organization, and to sort of really move away from these silos and fragmented units that we place everything into, and can we begin to understand how things actually are connected and related to each other, and how will that help us in understanding the reality of what we are facing today. Now, using that systems view framework, we are going to look at our food web today, and I'm going to just share a few thoughts, and then we will begin our dialogue and discussion, or whatever we want to call it. Like I said yesterday, there are no solutions, there are no answers really, but it's more of an opportunity for us to view life with a different perspective. So let's get going with our food web today, right? And we're going to start with a very simple question. Where does my food come from? How does it get from the field to my fingers? And that's a good place to start, because yesterday in one of the discussions, all of us talked about how it can be very overwhelming, this complex relationship network that exists on the planet. It can be very overwhelming to think that we have to understand all of this before we can even begin to, contribute to creating difference or bring about any kind of transformation, moving away towards a more, towards a planet that is definitely more balanced, that can sustain life, right? So it can be very overwhelming when we look at it in this whole relationship, interconnectedness sort of an approach. So then it's important at this point to sort of break it down, right? And let's understand the various elements of it, and then after try and put back the pieces and see how they connect, right? So a good place to start would be the food system, we thought, because it's tangible, we all can relate to it, and it's a big part of our lives, right? So we all know this, that everything we eat has a story. So I'm going to start, just for purposes of today's discussion, I've just picked two things. One which is very significant from an ecological, economic, social, cultural, political, religious, from various sort of perspectives. It's a very important part of our food system, and that's milk. So a very simple schematic here about how, this is just to make sure we're all on the same page. I know pretty much all of you know how milk gets to our homes, but it always helps to sort of get all of us on to the same platform. So we of course have, the story of milk begins with both small dairy farmers and large dairy farmers. Countries like India, large parts of Asia actually, and Africa. Small dairy farmers are the backbone of the dairy industry and the dairy sector. So both in rural and urban areas, and typically small dairy farmers transport milk. It could be directly to milk vendors who then deliver it to our homes, or the small dairy farmers could be pouring milk to private milk processors like your Nestle, Britannia, Hudson, Heritage, etc., whole host of them. But they also, of course, form a large part of the government milk cooperatives. Depending on which city you're in, it could be an Amul or an Nandini or an Arvin or a Milma, Mother Dairy, and a whole range of other local milk cooperatives. So small dairy farmers are very strongly linked to these milk cooperatives, and some of them also pour into to the private milk processors. The large dairy farmers, both in rural and urban areas, predominantly actually pour into the private milk processors. Now the arrows are used, if you notice, there are two different colors. The green one denotes fresh raw milk, okay, and the grey one denotes processed milk, which is made from skimmed milk powder and butterfat, which is, of course, you know this very well, that when we buy milk in packets, we get 2% fat or 3% fat. Now, no cow or buffalo produces 2% or 3% fat milk. So obviously, it has gone through a processing stage. Now, when we directly get it from milk vendors, it's always raw milk, which we then, the processing is then done in our homes or in restaurants, whoever buys it directly from milk vendors. Whereas when it is sent to private milk processors from small farmers or large dairy farmers, the milk processors are the ones who, convert it to various products, right? The most basic one being milk. So the raw milk is just post-processed to produce skimmed milk powder. All the fat is removed, and then depending upon the kind of milk that is sold, whether it is a 2% or a 3% fat, the butter fat is added to the milk, and that's what we get in our packets. And that can be available with local milk parlors, corner shops, supermarkets, what have you. And then that again comes home, right? And from there, the milk comes to our homes where we use it. Of course, this is becoming rare, it is becoming incredibly rare, particularly in urban areas, is to get, and not just urban areas, in rural areas as well, to get it from your own cow or buffalo. Or if your preference is for a goat, to get it from your own animal, right? Which is then directly milked. So that's there is no supply chain per se here. Now, if you notice in the slide, there are these small boxes which say T, and those are the points of transportation, right? Even if it's small farmers going to milk vendors, invariably it gets transported, whether it's by an auto rickshaw or a motorcycle or a cycle, whatever, but some form of transportation is required here. And the reason I put this sort of transportation element into this is because we are going to talk about the milk story in the context of what we are experiencing today. And so that's why I thought it's important for us to keep it in our minds that these are the points of transportation. Also, it's important to understand these points of transportation from the perspective of something we were discussing yesterday, which was about global warming-induced climate change. So we'll come back to this a little bit later. Now, here I'm going to make an attempt to untangle this milk web that we just saw, right? Now, if we look at the milk story, right, it has various threads in it. Now, it's not as straightforward as the farmer, sort of milking the animal and providing the milk. There are various events that take place in order for this to happen. Central to this is, of course, land. You have those who have land, their cost of production invariably is lower than those who are landless, because when you have land, you have the ability to be able to grow some fodder or to be able to grow some form of food for the animal. You do have that option. But when you're landless, then you're completely dependent for everything externally. Right? You have to buy the fodder, you have to buy the feed, and so on. So land is very much a central part of the structural policy threads. And so therefore, policies relating to land rights, to land ownership become very important in this whole process. And also policies, reforms around land also become very important. Then there's another structural or a policy thread which would deal with globalization, trade, foreign investment. And why is this important? Because increasingly we have a lot of foreign investment in the dairy industry. We have global players coming into India, either through joint ventures or through in the form of some form of foreign direct investment, where they are engaging with local dairy companies or dairy processors. And that is also influencing the lives and the livelihoods of farmers. It's also influencing the price of milk to consumers. It's also influencing the choices of products that are available to us as consumers. And globalization and trade, which all form a part of this particular thread. Because with globalization, our requirements, our choices, our preferences are also being deeply influenced. And India increasingly integrating into the global market is impacting the procurement price, the price at which people buy, whether it's dairy processors or cooperatives buying milk from the milk producers who are the farmers. It's also influencing the price in the market when you have competing players where some have an advantage over the others, right? And then there is, of course, the socio-cultural and political influence, ideological influences as well, because as part of the agricultural cycle of dairying, a very important element of it is what happens to the animal at the end of its productive life, right? The animal, once it's not productive for a small farmer particularly, and a huge amount, anywhere from 70 to 80% of our milk is produced by small farmers. They are the backbone of our dairy industry. So they can't afford to maintain an animal. They can't afford to feed an animal when it enters the end of its productive life. So then they have to sell it in the market. And when it's sold in the market, then it's sold primarily for meat, right? So this is where the political ideological influences, which all of you are very, very familiar with the whole ban on cattle slaughter and its impact on the livelihoods of small farmers. What do they do when they can't dispose? I mean, when they sort of can't sell their animal, when they can't raise capital in order to be able to buy new dairying animals. So these are some of the threads that are sort of, we were talking about hidden connections, which often we don't see. So this is sort of underlying the whole dairy industry in India. Then there is, of course, the issue of ethics around animal products and consumption. We are informed by that a lot. The whole idea of veganism and which informs people's choices and preferences for whether they choose to consume dairy products or not. So that also, of course, has an impact on the story of milk, particularly in the context of livelihoods of small farmers. There is, of course, a special situation with COVID-19 because those teas that I showed you, those were blocked for some time. So when we had the first lockdown and it wasn't very clear what was allowed, what was not allowed, there was severe blockages in these transportations, which then impacted, and many of us have seen these photographs in the newspapers, where farmers were disposing their milk because there was no way to. And I live in Kerala, and one of the problems that we had was that the milk was produced here. There was surplus milk, which had to be then, which is typically the typical process is it's taken across to Tamil Nadu across the border, where it's processed to produce skimmed milk powder and butterfat. Now, when the milk could not be taken across the border because Kerala doesn't have the capacity to process all its raw milk, we process some of it, but we don't process all of it. So when that happened, then there was a glut of liquid milk, which is a perishable. So, how do you deal with that? So there was, so one of the good things that did happen, of course, that it was distributed in and provided as the part of the midday meal scheme for children who were at home, but it was delivered to their homes. So, but then there was this. It was a fair amount of a crisis, because what do you do with perishable items, right? So again, when we think of policies, particularly in situations where anyway livelihoods have been hit, and when you are affected by something like this, so thinking of policies and responding to things like epidemics, one has to also keep this understanding in mind. And then there is, in the whole milk web, is the consumer choice, right? Our own influences, our socio-cultural influences, our demand for global brands, where our choices and tastes are influenced by what is current in various countries. So, for example, the flavored yogurt, different frozen desserts, right? So there is this huge demand for global brands, and that is pushed significantly by large corporations and agribusinesses, which then manifests itself in the form of foreign direct investment. So there is this whole cycle of choice response to choice, but then the question is, how is our choice influenced? There is this large advertising industry as well, which influences our choices. So do we really have free choice in that sense? And then there's, of course, the big issue of health and nutrition, particularly in a country like India, where malnourishment is a big part. We were talking about the triple burden yesterday, and malnourishment is a huge crisis in the country, as we're all very, very much aware of. So if we're talking about, when we talk about ethics and animal products, how does that relate to the reduction of dietary animal foods, which has been a big demand globally, right? But in a country like India, we actually need to provide more dietary animal foods for certain sections of society in order to be able to rejuvenate health and nutrition for certain sections of society, particularly women and children, right? Because nutrition is such a critical part of brain development. So that, and as well as anemia, which is one of our biggest micronutrient deficiency issues in India. For young women, for women in the reproductive age, for lactating mothers, and for young children. So this whole issue of the dietary animal foods, and how does that play into the dairy industry? And then, like I said earlier as well, our choices do influence livelihoods, right? So now let's move on to another story, which is the story of palm oil, right? Now, palm oil, of course, has been sort of integrated into our public distribution system, and it is the cheapest oil that's available in the market. But if we were to sort of understand what is happening with the global palm oil production, right? 85% of it comes from Malaysia and Indonesia, and that requires extensive clearance of tropical rainforests. So if we were to just quickly go back one step and look at the situation in India, right? 60% of our edible oil requirement comes from palm oil that is imported, right? Now, if we are to look at some numbers, we find that between 2001 and 2018, the palm oil consumption increased by 230%. Now, that's a huge increase, right? And 60% of this is met by import of palm oil. So now what does that mean for India's traditional oil seeds, right? What does it mean for mustard oil, coconut oil, groundnut oil, and safflower oil, sunflower oil? What does it mean for all of our local nuts and oil seeds? What does it mean for that industry? And related to that, what does it mean from a dietary perspective? Because we typically, the oils we use are from seeds that are grown locally, right? And that has a nutritional implication, because significant part of our nutrition does come from the kind of fat we consume, right? So there are dietary implications of that, there are health implications of that, there are ecological implications of it, because oil seeds were part of the mixed crop cultivation. They were part of they were part of an agrobiodiversity, and they still are a part of an agrobiodiversity in the country. So, and they are, and each of these oil seeds are suited for certain agroecological conditions. So what does it mean, for all that? So a policy decision where we're looking at 60% of our edible oil coming through import, what does it mean for all of this? What are the impacts that it may have? And of course, very importantly, on livelihoods. Local production attempts, have been made since the 1980s. There are oilseed policies. There is a lot of, noise that has been made around it, but we're still at a situation where we are importing so much. Now, there were attempts to grow palm oil locally. There are geographical and climatic constraints to that. And again, there is the other issue of plantation cultivation, right? So when we're talking about diverse oilseed cultivation, we're talking not only about agrobiodiversity, but we're also talking about polycultures, where we're growing multiple crops and we're not sort of privileging one, kind of oil over another. So now let's look at what is happening with the tropical rainforest, right? So when we have extensive clearance of tropical rainforests, obviously there is a release of greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, methane, oxides of nitrogen as well, but primarily carbon dioxide here. Not only are the greenhouse gases, sort of released into the environment because the clearance is done by burning, but there is also a loss of the carbon that is embedded in the soil. So that is lost as well. And the ability of these forests to hold carbon. So it's all of these things which get impacted, and greenhouse gas emissions, of course, impact global warming and therefore climate change. The other elements associated with this clearance of tropical rainforests is loss of wildlife habitat. And then there was the whole East Asian haze, where Singapore experienced this huge haze of smoke and particulates as a result of the clearance of rainforests in Malaysia and Indonesia through burning. Because when you have to clear large-scale tropical rainforests, you resort to burning. And this was pushed by large corporations, agribusiness, which is engaged in palm oil cultivation. So you have loss of wildlife habitat, which increases human-wildlife contact, because when you clear the habitat, wildlife move away from there in search of food and in search of shelter. And also human beings get closer to wildlife because they're also moving away from the sort of the edges of the forests have become, are receding further and further. So when this human wildlife contact increases, at one level, there are conflicts. There is the man-animal conflict, but there is also the issue of zoonosis, which we talked about yesterday, which is microbial infection jumping from animals, particularly wild animals, to domestic animals and then to humans. And we are seeing an impact of that through what's happening with COVID-19. So this is this very, very complex relationship that emerges from the use of, from a, when we privilege one kind of food or one kind of production or one kind of cultivation over one of diversity, right? So actually, in reality, when we look at the food system, and we talked very briefly about it yesterday, it is a bunch of other systems which are engaging with each other. So we have the economic system, we have the biological system, the political system, and the social system. So the supply, if you will, if you sort of look at it as supply and demand, the supply is coming in from the biological system, from farming, right? Where you have inputs into cultivation, and the inputs including land, soil, water, all of that going into cultivation. You have nutrients which go into cultivation. You have pest control elements which go into cultivation. And then we just talked about the biological systems, right? You have issues when we're talking about industrial farming, particularly. You have issues associated with animal welfare. You have issues associated with biodiversity, land use change, and so on. And then, of course, you have the economic system, which is driving a lot of this form of cultivation, this form of production, actually. And then there is the demand, which emerges from the social system, which is influenced significantly by socio-cultural and the economic system, right? And the demand which emerges from the social system also deeply impacts the biological system, some of it which we saw earlier, but also in terms of the waste that is generated from the social system. And then there is the political system, which which is responsible for the kind of policies that we have for our food system and how it impacts every element of this entire network, if you will. Now, if we were to sort of just look back at, both the stories that we looked at, whether it was oil or dairy, we find a few things in common, which is that it's increasingly the modern food system is agribusiness and industrial production distribution dominated, right? And like I said earlier, its policies of trade are largely governed by agribusiness and so-called developed countries and economies which are where there is a strong relationship between the agribusiness and the political system and the geopolitics, right? And so more often than not, it deeply disadvantages the smaller producers. Right? They are nowhere in the picture, right? And then, like I said earlier, we're talking about dominant political ideologies which privilege some food cultures over others. Some food cultures are considered superior or more modern over others, and within food cultures, certain kinds of foods are considered taboo, and certain other kinds of foods are considered to be purer or should be considered superior, right? And then consumer choice that we talked about. Now, across the food system, another thing that's happening is that socio-ecological systems are being transformed, right? It's not just ecological systems anymore, right? I mean, we were talking about ecosystems yesterday, but really, we all recognize this, that there's a very inextricable link between social and ecological systems. You can't talk anymore about one independently, right? Whether it is land use changes, the quality of food that we produce, all of it so tightly engaged with each other. And then there is, and this is very important when we talk about socio-ecological systems, are these three ideas of availability of food, the affordability of food, and the accessibility, and specifically to nutritious foods. And this is very critical from an Indian perspective, right? Because of all of the things that we've discussed earlier about the nutritional challenges that we face. So food is available in plenty. I mean, we keep reading about and we keep seeing this, and we all know this, that we are producing more than enough food to feed every person in this country. So there is food available. What is this kind of food? Is it privileging only certain kinds of grains? That is a different question. But if you're talking about caloric food, yes, it's available. It's largely available in the form of cereals, and only 3 cereals are privileged over others. But it's available, right? So caloric hunger shouldn't be the problem in our country. It shouldn't be. Then there's the question of affordability. So who can afford this food, right? And that determines your accessibility to nutritious foods. Because more often than not, the majority of our population can only afford the caloric value, but they cannot afford the nutrition. So therefore, accessibility to nutritious food is our biggest challenge, right? And whether it is undernutrition or overnutrition, because even in overnutrition, there is this issue of accessibility to nutritious foods, but it's not because of affordability, it's because of various other reasons, right? It's because of choice as well. Now, at the heart of our food system, at the heart of this crisis that we are sort of going through, is that local cultures, local food cultures, and the collective community structures, which informed a traditionally diversified food system in the country, that has been eroded significantly. Yeah, and the erosion continues. So now I want us to quickly shift to two things that we talked about yesterday as well. One is global warming induced climate change, where we will look a little more closely at the relationship between industrial food systems and global warming induced climate change. So we'll sort of now, from a sort of a telescopic view, we'll just get down to a microscopic view. And let's just look at some numbers here, right? We've already seen that industrial food systems, they are characterized by low agrobiodiversity, right? We all know that, it's rice, wheat, and maize that are privileged over a whole bunch of other grains, which are classified under millets and ironically called, coarse grains, right? Which are diverse and nutritionally very rich. So those have been relegated to the background, and it's not just grain, right? It's also pulses, it's oil seeds that we just discussed, it's vegetables, it's fruit, it's meats, it's various things, right? So it's characterized by low agrobiodiversity because the cultivation privileges a certain kind of monoculturism, right? And then there's a huge dependence on fossil fuel, whether it is for production, so whether it is chemical pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, they require fossil fuel because they're petrochemical based, right? Then transportation, increased mechanization, which is all fossil fuel dependent. And transportation, because our food system has become this long supply chain, because we're getting food from huge distances, right? And because of the whole issue of globalization and the trade issues that we just discussed earlier, we also, and also the point about importing, say, for example, palm oil in large percentages. So transportation is extremely fossil fuel dependent, and the kind of transportation that's used. So this industrial food system is contributing a significant amount globally to climate change. Now, if you look at it globally, 26% of the greenhouse gases, which would be carbon dioxide, methane, oxides of nitrogen, 26% of that comes from the industrial food system, right? And 50% of the land globally is used for agriculture. So that means only the remaining 50% has forests and urban areas and herbs and shrubs and semi-arid kind of vegetation and fresh water. So 50% of it is under agriculture. And if we look at fresh water, so you can see a progression there in the image. 70% of fresh water is withdrawn for agriculture, right? And yesterday we were talking, and somebody had a question yesterday about the nitrogen cycle when we discussed it. And I was telling you that, the nitrogen cycle, when it gets imbalanced, it causes eutrophication, which is basically contamination of water bodies with high nitrogen and then phosphorus as well. So we're looking at 78% of our global ocean and fresh water, right, is affected by eutrophication. And then, of course, there's biodiversity. 94% of the mammalian biomass, okay, which excludes human beings, is essentially livestock, right? And the wild mammals, if you look at it, is only the remaining 6%. So this gives us a sense of the relationship between global warming induced climate change and the industrial food system. And there were two things that I was talking about yesterday. One was the Darfur crisis in Sudan, and the other was the Syrian crisis, right? The Syrian conflict. Now, when we looked at the Syrian conflict, popular media and by and large for most of us, it was a war that was, it was a civil war, and it was because of an oppressive regime, right? But in reality, it actually started with the suffering of people in rural areas. So there is this beautiful, a graphic representation of the climate change being the basis of the Syrian conflict, or being one of the important factors affecting the Syrian conflict. And I have a link here which I will send off to Naeem, which he can share, because this is a really beautiful way to understand the whole Syrian war in the context of climate change. So between 2006 and 2011, 50% of the country was reeling under drought. Okay, and one of the causes for this has been, it has been attributed to climate change because we know that climate change is causing a lot of extreme weather events. So one of the reasons could be because of climate change. And so almost 85% of livestock died. And as a result of this, there was deep conflict, which then triggered into, and that conflict then moved to Damascus, and then it became a political conflict. So really at the heart of social conflict. So it's not just an ecological issue, really. When we are stressed for our lives and livelihoods, it immediately manifests itself as civil conflict, right? Now, if we look at the Darfur situation in Sudan, right, this was a conflict between pastoralists and sedentary farmers because artificial boundaries have been created. And this, of course, is a legacy of colonialism, like we've had in India, like we've had in large parts of the country. This is in Africa. where artificial boundaries that were drawn between countries affected the movement of nomadic pastoralists. So when there were so as a result of these enclosures and these constraints on movement, there was what used to be accommodations and negotiations and arrangements between pastoralists and sedentary farmers traditionally erupted into a conflict of property and encroachment. And so that was one of the reasons actually for the conflict in Darfur as well, okay, which then of course became a political conflict, and we've all sort of seen the humanitarian crisis that it resulted in. So really, if you look at the food system, it has a lot to answer for, if, you know, from the point of view of what's happening to both from an ecological and a social point of view. I'm going to just quickly go through the issue of zoonosis. We covered some of it when we were talking about the oil, the seed, oil seed situation. So here again, we talked about the structural transformation that has taken place in the industrial food system because of changes in the way we govern in the governance systems of how natural resources and natural systems are perceived, and the whole policies around agribusiness, around livestock, around livelihoods, animal rearing. So all of the policies and the structural transformation that has taken place in this in order to accommodate an industrial food system, that has triggered land use changes, which has led to the increased human livestock wildlife contact, and which has manifested itself, one of its manifestations is in the form of zoonosis leading to epidemics and pandemics. The industrial food system has also resulted in a huge market transformation, which is really a structural transformation. And that has, you know, the supermarketization, the issue of shelf life. And then there is this battle between the push for supermarkets and increased shelf life versus what are called local, fresh, or wet markets, right? And wet markets or fresh markets have come up very strongly in this whole issue of COVID-19. But local, fresh, or wet markets, when when organized locally, when organized like they are meant to be organized, where there isn't this congestion of wildlife and domestic livestock, where small farmers and particularly rural communities, as in the case of China, were pushed to actually breed wild animals because the market transformation had pushed them marginally to the margins, where their livelihoods in farming and in livestock rearing had completely been impacted by agribusiness. So they were constantly marginalized, and that pushed them towards having to trade in wildlife, and that's how some of the wet markets got impacted. And so to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater, and to sort of relegate all local fresh markets, give them, sort of brand them as sources of zoonoses and epidemics, is hugely detrimental to livelihoods of farmers. And in India, of course, many of our biodiverse protected areas recently, as recent as April, May 2020, have been either unlocked or preparing to be unlocked for large projects. And what its impact is going to be, we will all see, but we saw some of it happening in Assam recently with the blowout of the oil wells, right? And we will sort of really look at a couple of more things before I sort of stop so that we can have a discussion. So one thing I want to leave us with is also that all of these are not one-off events or phenomena, right? They are actually structures. They're actually structural things that are happening. And there are some hidden connections that I want to just throw out there for our discussion, right? When we talk about clearing rainforests. So it's interesting that, when we talk about clearance of rainforests, apart from all the things that we talked about, that actually these rainforests, they serve as firewalls. They serve as firewalls between ecosystems which have wildlife and human society and sort of human habitation. And that's how historically we've sort of not had, while we've had pandemics and epidemics, but these firewalls have been very important in preventing much greater such epidemics from happening. And the rainforests really serve as what are called biotic pumps, which is, they release moisture into the air. You have cloud formation from them, but they also have a very strong cooling effect, which is why where there are a lot of forests, you automatically have a lot more rain, because forests release particulates which form nuclei for condensation, and that water vapor, when it condensates, we receive rain. So rainforests not just generate a water vapor and as a result cloud formation, but also serve as nuclei for rainfall. Now, what is interesting is the relationship between clearing rainforests, reduction in rainfall, and water scarcity. And we're seeing today with COVID-19 that water scarcity is deeply going to impact us in protecting ourselves from the disease, because one of the things that we have to do constantly is use water to disinfect ourselves, to wash our hands with soap. So water scarcity is significantly affecting protection against a disease, which like COVID-19, right? So this whole interrelationship, there are so many layers and connections that we need to understand and unearth. And so it's very, very important to understand the centrality of ecosystems, intact ecosystems, and sort of not just regenerating them, but also preventing the kind of loss that is happening as a result of our modern food systems. So I'm going to sort of quickly go through this one, which is essentially, I just want to point out a couple of things here that, intensive livestock production that we are engaging in, right? It's not only about the clearance of forests, but it's also about how the production takes place, right? We're deeply compromising what is being called biosecurity, because when you have animals in confined spaces, right, you are allowing for disease transmission to happen, right? And you're not just narrowing the genetic diversity, because you're multiplying the same breed and the same, you're literally interbreeding because you want only certain kinds of animals, high milking animals, high animals which have, you're pumping animals with antibiotics and hormones because you want them to produce more meat, right? So it's the way of, as opposed to animals being part of our agricultural cycle, and therefore they were part of our food cycle. Whether we were eating, whether we eat mutton or beef or chicken, when they're part of the agricultural cycle, then you have the genetic diversity, right? So, so these are some things to think about in this whole context of food systems. And of course, climate change, which we've talked about, and how we've been sort of really looking at food as a commodity, um, where we are even labeling seeds as proprietary, and not letting them, not sort of being what they really should be, which is they are common pool resources. I mean, they are, seeds are meant to be exchanged and shared, and there's nothing proprietary about life, right? You can't really appropriate life like that. I'm going to skip some of this because we talked a little bit about it yesterday, where where we're saying that the dominant response has been, symptomatic, and sort of, it has really been about firefighting. So what we're saying at this point is we're saying that a transformation is an imperative. And what we're also saying that it is possible, right? If we begin to really understand these relationships and begin to radically reimagine our food systems, it's very, very possible. As Karen Washington says, when she's an urban agricultural leader in New York, and she sort of says, the food system is not broken, but it's because it's working like our caste system, which is based on demographics, economics, and race. So if we're really going to transform this food system, right, we have to look at power and structures of power. Who has the power, right? And can we take some of that power in a collective fashion? And can we reimagine the way we produce food? So we can go back to the nested systems that we were talking about yesterday and really consider, how do we restore those patterns and organizations that we talked about yesterday, the cycles, the rhythms, and understand these power structures and see how we can transform some of these power structures. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and not sort of go to the what next slide, because that we can do towards the end. And I'm going to sort of get out of the presenting mode, and we can throw it open for discussion. I'm sorry, I think I took much more time than I imagined I would.
Not at all. You're just in time, I think.
Yeah, okay, great.
As I call it. Yeah. So now it's open for people to ask questions or reflect on the presentation. Uh, there is one message which Madhu Reddy has dropped at the beginning.
Yes. Yeah, hi Madhu. Yes, the world's largest dairy player, and I think and also Madhu, I wanted to, and I'm sure you've read this report on the milk crisis where we talk about from the Food Sovereignty Alliance, where we talk about this whole issue of the entry of these very large dairy players into the country, and extensive entry. Yeah, absolutely, yes. So Nusser, okay, so this is a very, very important question, I think. So how do we feed urban areas without the industrial food system? That's an interesting point. Now, I think Cuba has really actually shown us the way significantly there, Nusser. We're going to talk more about it tomorrow, but I would like us to think about, when we talk about transformation, is that there are multiple ways of growing food with. Okay, let me just roll back a little bit and say that an overnight change is unrealistic and impractical. But what we're looking at is we're saying that there are humongous numbers of examples of initiatives all over the world and in India where people have shown how it's possible to have a more transformed system. Okay, so now, so having said that, it has to be a transition where you have to have both systems, and as one evolves, the other one has to unevolve. Okay, so that's how it has to happen. So your question is, which areas or communities in India are managing to keep their food system sustainable? Now, sustainability is a very, very big question there, and globally too, it's very, very. The only example that I can come closest to in terms of an attempt towards sustainability on a large scale at a countrywide is what happened in Cuba, and that was because of the position that they were placed in. I am going to discuss it in great detail tomorrow, Nusser, the Cuban story, but just for your information, in case you're not familiar with the Cuban story, the Cuban model is completely dependent on urban farming and local markets and collective networks. So it's interesting that you asked this question of, and in India, okay, there are smaller urban, peri-urban, rural connections that are being established, whether it is in Bangalore or whether it is in and more so in rural India actually. And there is the whole Organic Farmers Association of India networks. So there are networks which have innumerable examples of people, of communities where local markets have been created. And I myself have been engaged with communities which have created local markets, but at a more rural town sort of a connection. Okay, but it's not in a form, and these communities which are doing this kind of work, and Madhu herself has been engaging with agrobiodiverse cultivation, I know that. So the thing is that the structural barriers are immense. And so in order for us to emerge from these structural barriers, a much greater, stronger movement has to happen. Examples are available. Globally as well, examples are available. Navdanya is another example of work that's been happening in Uttarakhand. Okay, so the thing is, of course, to overcome these barriers, and the way forward to overcome these barriers is coming from social movements. Yeah. So Nusser has a last question for today. No, Nusser, you're most welcome to ask more questions. Which commercial foods in India use the maximum pesticides or chemicals? I'm not sure what you mean by commercial foods, but there are definitely a lot of vegetables, etc. Certain kinds of vegetables, particularly things like cauliflower, and then among fruits, grapes, which use a lot of pesticides when they're grown commercially. Yes, they are. And I'm not sure what you mean by commercial food. So it would be good to clear that. But meanwhile, let me look at some of the other questions. We have interesting ones. And Devika, your thoughts on genetically modified foods and whether they're healthy. Now, that's a minefield that you're opening, Devika. So I'm going to lay it out in sort of multiple ways here. So genetically modified foods, with the evidence that we have available to date, okay, we need at least 30 years of data to show us its ecological and human health impacts, okay? But from what we know today, and from what we know from the way these genetically modified foods or genetically modified seeds more so are produced, there are many, many issues here, okay? So when we talk about genetically modified foods, one of the issues, of course, is that there is a huge diversity of vegetables, fruit, animals that we already have, whose biodiversity is likely to be impacted with the release of genetically modified seeds which produce genetically modified foods. So for example, today, soya, corn are two big examples. And then of course in India, we've had the whole battle with BT brinjal and then later with GM mustard. Now the transgenic, okay, so the when you genetically modify a food, the protein change that happens, we don't know what impact that is likely to have on human beings. That's one, okay? So in the absence of such a situation, a precautionary principle is very important till you get adequate evidence, right? The other thing is, again, genetically modified foods, you go back, why are you genetically modifying foods? Because you want a certain kind of crop. You want a crop with a certain property, right? So if you want that, you're immediately cutting back on diversity. And we just talked about the problems when you erode biodiversity. When you erode diversity, the resilience of the entire ecosystem is compromised deeply. Okay. So I am hoping that answers your question of whether they are healthy, because I'm hoping that this answer addresses that as well, right? But it's this huge area of discussion, and I'll be while I've just sort of touched, some points in it, and of course the other impact of it is on the socio-ecological impact, because it affects, because farmers have to buy these seeds, so immediately it demolishes livelihoods as well. Okay, so at many levels, we're talking about human health, we're talking about ecological impact, we're talking about livelihoods and social impacts. So all of these together, there are issues with genetically modified foods, right? So then, okay, Durga, why has our government always been giving palm oil on ration cards? I did not know it was being imported for so long. Because it's very cheap, and it's interesting, no, Durga, it's cheaper to buy that palm oil than to produce it within the country. And also the other thing with palm oil is its properties, right? It's used extensively, not just in in direct consumption, but it's used extensively in everything that we have, from cosmetics to Oreo cookies to to everything. It's cheap. It has shelf life properties, which allows it to be used very easily. So that is why it is preferred over many other oils. And because it's cheap, it's sold through our ration shops. That's exactly why it's sold. So Madhu's comment is that we need nutrient-dense foods, absolute foods, and eating more of this. Less, of course, we've been eating less nutritionally dense foods for a very, very, very long time. And also, there's this interesting study that has been done of nutrition per acre, measuring the value of food and the quality of food in terms of nutrition per acre as opposed to yield in hectare, yield per acre or hectare, yield in kilograms or in tons or in quintals per acre. So then if you do that, then a farm that produces ecologically diverse or agroecologically diverse foods actually has a higher nutritional value than one that produces, say, the same amount of just one crop. Yeah. Devika again. Yeah, buying fresh vegetables from the mandi or buying in bulk from hyper retail stores in malls. Aha, Devika, you've been reading up. So see, buying fresh vegetables from the mandi, think about it, right? When you buy the fresh vegetables from the mandi, the money goes to the person who's sitting there. right? Now, that person may not be the farmer themselves, but it is a livelihood for that person, right? And typically, when you're buying fresh vegetables from the mandi, you are also getting better quality. Not necessary that it may be grown without chemicals. It may be grown with chemicals for sure, but you're getting it fresher than what you get in a hypermarket or a retail store. The other thing is when you go to a hypermarket or a retail store, you are contributing to a large agribusiness chain rather than to the smaller livelihood requiring people. And in India, our informal economy really, I mean, what is called the unorganized or the informal economy is what supports this country. And so there's a whole set of people whose livelihoods come from selling vegetables. Yeah. And also it's much more fun, no? I mean, you're going there, you're touching the vegetable, you're having a conversation with somebody. So you're actually engaging with the process of food, isn't it? And then I'll take another of Devika's and then come back to Margi's, yeah. And there are seasonal vegetables available 365 days. How is that possible? That's the industrial food system for you, because you can produce it under diverse conditions and you can transport it from anywhere. So, for example, you're getting watermelons throughout the year because watermelon is grown in some places or it's grown under controlled condition and it's being made available to you and me. And it's interesting how we've alienated ourselves from seasonal, because a lot of us don't even know what is seasonal vegetable anymore, right? And so therefore, by transportation, we're also, again, contributing to the fossil fuel consumption process. Margi, I'm curious about how you were able to communicate these complex ideas while teaching in school. Well, I had a whole year. That's one thing. But also do it largely through stories and through examples. And one really beautiful way to sort of that I really have enjoyed is to get children to look at where does my food come from. So you get them to maintain a diary, a food diary of what they eat every day, and then ask them to trace back, right? Ask them to sort of break it down and say, okay, where does my food come from? Talk to your parents. What are the ingredients in what you ate today? Where do each of those ingredients come from? How far back do you have to go and buy it? And 9 out of 10, they will only be able to go up to the grocery store from which they buy. Then go to the grocery store, talk to them, find out where it comes from. So then, children begin to understand, and there are several aha moments for children here. It's a great revelation when they begin to understand under what conditions many of these are produced, because it then forces them to ask the questions and seek information and maybe engage with people who know some of these things, right? So that is how, in fact, that slide that I showed you of the milk one is actually from my 12th standard, when I used to teach in the 12th standard. Yeah. Okay, Anjana. Among the topics which are being dropped from the CBSE syllabus right now is also the one on sources of energy. How, if at all, is that going to affect people's understanding of ecosystems and subsequently? Oh, that's huge. I mean, it's quite ridiculous what they're dropping from the CBSE syllabus, right? They're dropping sources of energy, they're dropping citizenship, they're dropping, democracy and understanding of it. So not just understanding ecosystems but also how do you understand food systems if you don't understand these social connections, right? So I'm not sure why this particular thing is being dropped, because there is no explanation for why this is happening. No, you're absolutely right to be worried about that. Yeah. Nusair, so Anjana, you were saying something. Sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
The explanation given is that they wanted to not burden students right now. That's there.
Right. So, I mean, it's interesting, no? What is perceived as a burden, right? I mean, how is source of energy perceived? I don't know. This just flummoxes me, actually. Yeah.
Thank you.
Not at all. Nusair, I like your cautionary preface of 30 years evidence is needed for GMO foods. But well, it's true. I mean, you really need long-term. You really do need, I mean, that's what scientists are talking about, that you need. So the precautionary principle is absolutely critical here. Yeah. Yes, that's true, Madhu. A lot of people think that GMO is not yet. Well, the other day when I was looking at a khakra packet, and I saw that khakra was fried in cottonseed oil, and cottonseed oil comes from cottonseed cakes, as Madhu pointed out. And it's being used extensively for foodstuffs. So it's very much a part of our food cycle. And, we're also buying soya, right? I mean, a lot of the soya, if it's imported particularly, we don't know. If it's imported soya, 95%, 95 to 98% of the soya in the world is genetically modified. And and corn as well. So it's very much a part of our food system. And it's interesting that corn is not just used as food directly, right? We're using fructose corn syrup in every possible food item that is processed. So just look at the ingredients of something you buy the next time, and you will find fructose corn syrup as a sweetening agent. And that comes from corn, which, like I said, a significant part of it is from genetically modified. So Gayatri, yes, you have a question. Is a shorter supply chain of the food produce an answer to sustainability, or is a decentralized growing system like urban farmers feeding urban areas? I think it's both, actually, because when we talk about urban farmers feeding urban areas, see, the thing is that it's not just one thing that's going to work, right? It's got to be a diversity of options that we have to look at, isn't it? So a shorter supply chain, definitely, we know from COVID-19 that it's these long supply chains that were a problem, because when the lockdowns happened all over the world, there were many points where they were blocked. Like, for example, I'll give you this example. In India, of course, we've seen it where, the access to vegetables and fruit and meat and milk became a problem. But globally, the meat industry all over the world came to a standstill, because Rosario, which is this port in Argentina, is the biggest, is the port which sends out the largest amount of soya. Okay, and soya meal is used as feed for cattle all over the world. Okay, so therefore, you had the United States, you had Europe, they weren't receiving the soya meal, which meant that they couldn't feed the animals, which means if you don't feed the animals, the meat production gets impacted, right? So the meat industry all over the world came to a standstill because of this one port, Rosario. So you're talking about this long supply chain of food, which, when it's blocked at various points, it just collapses the entire food system, right? So therefore, Gayatri's question of the shorter supply chain, yes, it makes complete sense. But like I said, it has to be a hybrid of solutions. So I hope that addresses your question, Gayatri. And we can always come back to the question again, yeah. Margi, yes, I do this food trail with my student. What's in my thali? Oh, that would be super. And then, get them to trail back as far back as they can go. And then you can also drop in information where, when they have a roadblock. And that's a great way to get them to understand. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we are a small number of just 14 of us. So, feel free to just unmute and ask questions. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, could you just throw some light on the psychology of food? Because when I was doing my, PhD in organizational behavior, much of that, psychological component goes into consumer psychology, and this
Right.
whole bunch of ideas that you have to sell and
Correct.
availability of the food.
Yes.
So,
Very, very true. Sorry,
yeah,
go
so
ahead, Naeem. I just want to say.
not at all. So I was just, wondering if you could give us some information about how this consumerism is related to the psychology, or there is this huge subject called psychology of food per se.
Yes, that
Yeah,
is.
so the way that we eat, and that also results into overnutrition or obesity
Yes,
on one hand, and on the other hand, we also have malnutrition and starvation.
that's right. I'll come back to your question, because it's a very critical question, because it really determines what we are eating. I'll just finish with Nusair. He's got this one question about invert sugar. Yes, invert sugar is high fructose corn syrup, and this is in all our processed foods, Nusair, absolutely. So coming back, and Durga, yes. Children attaining puberty earlier than before, is there evidence that it's changed? Yes, it is. There is evidence of hormonal use in chicken, hormonal use in other meats, hormonal use in milk. Yes, there is evidence, and I can actually probably send you some references to that, Durga. I will make a note of that and put it in the email for Naeem. Yeah. So Naeem, coming back to your question on psychology of food, yes, it's an absolutely separate branch of study because of what the modern industrial food system has. Um, you know, uh, Sorry, I'm just writing this down. Puberty in children and reference for Durga. So Durga, I'll send. You'll have that for tomorrow. So Naeem, yes. So psychology of food, because it's about satiation, and it is so strongly connected to our neurological system, right? Because we eat for for satisfaction, but we also eat for emotional satisfaction. We also eat for we also eat to be what should I call it, in tune with our peers, right? We eat for so many reasons. We pick what we eat not just to satisfy hunger or appetite, right? We eat. I mean, it's fascinating how many factors influence what we eat, and in a very subliminal manner, these messages that we get from advertisements, right? They have a huge impact on what we choose to eat, and whether it is children or adults. Because Nusser was talking about invert sugar, I was just thinking there's this other issue, right? I mean, where we talk about 100% natural, right? Sugar free, okay? No synthetic sugars added or something like that, right? So when they say 100% natural or 100% organic, I mean, what does it even mean? What does this 100% natural even mean, right? So, so that is one level. The messaging that we are getting, the messaging we're getting from advertisements, what is good for your health, and also these newspaper snippets, right? And we all know that the food system, the agribusiness and food corporations have invested so much in advertisements, so much in research. And whenever you read about something being good for your health, yeah, I would strongly advise that you follow the money, as they say. There is always a money trail behind many of these things because they're all paid news items that are put out there, most of them. Okay, because food is a whole, right? I mean, you eat food, you're not, I mean, which of us is looking at food as, okay, this has got protein, this has got this has got this nutrition, that nutrition, therefore I must eat it, right? I mean, that's such a sad way of eating food, isn't it? Because food is an emotional experience, right? I mean, so therefore, we've been so trained in our heads and indoctrinated at one level to look at food in a very mechanistic fashion.
Yeah, certainly. No, it also reminds me of some of my relatives who
Yeah,
lived in Gulf. They
yeah,
stopped drinking water, and whenever they go to KFC or McD, they
yeah,
only have this Coke or Pepsi.
correct.
So water is replaced by this, huge,
Beverage.
beverages
Yeah,
of
yeah.
of
It's also
this.
addictive. It's also addictive. Just like like Madhu was talking about salt. Both salt and sugar are deeply addictive.
Right.
So therefore, what happens is it perpetuates this cycle. And from a neurological perspective, I mean, there's a lot of neurological evidence. There's this tremendous amount of neurological evidence that shows this. And there's this absolutely wonderful book on the psychology of food that I have used a fair bit in some of the research that I've done. And that's probably a reference that we can put out there as well. I mean, there's a lot of work done on the psychology of food, not just through advertisements, but also how we respond and how we create habits, and also how we bring up our children, right? What our children exposed to in their childhood, right? Like, for example, there is this, exposing children to refined sugars or salt very early in life, right? So that actually deeply influences a child's state.
Can
And
I
also,
ask?
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
sure, Angela, please go ahead. Yes, yes.
Right. So I tried to look up documentaries on meat and the meat
Uh-huh.
industry,
Yeah,
and they were mostly American ones. So
yeah, yeah,
they
yeah.
discussed some. So there was this one documentary called Cowspiracy, which discussed
Oh,
how
yes,
the
conspiracy,
meat
yes.
is set.
Yeah.
And I just wanted you to help me out and explain what the difference between how meat is manufactured there versus here is.
Okay, great. Great question, Anjana. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Because I could only think of how the beef ban had affected the leather industry, and I couldn't think of any other articles.
Right,
Right.
great. And Anjana, I'm very happy to share some material with you. If you can sort of put your email down, or you can take my email, which is just my name actually. It is radha.gopalan@gmail.com. I can probably just put it in here.
Right. Thank you.
And I can send you a lot of examples of how you can explain about this whole issue of, what um, how livestock rearing and meat consumption and all of that happens, not just in India, but also in several Asian countries and in African countries and Latin America as well, and how the industrial meat system functions, right? So I'll send you some information for sure. I'll send it across. I mean, you can just send me your email and we can share resources. So that we, yeah.
Can I ride on Anjana's question about meat?
Oh,
and,
yeah, sure, absolutely.
Yeah, and question this chicken consumption we have, and seeing chickens being transported is such an ugly thing. So I had a habit that I'd go to the market, look the chicken in the eye, and try and get a country chicken which could stand on its own before asking it for its sacrifice. But it's become much more difficult now.
It is, Nusser, you're absolutely spot on. The chicken industry, I mean, 80% of chicken produced in India is from the broiler industry, 80 to 85, which is a real tragedy because other meats in our country, right, whether it's mutton or beef, etc., are part of the livelihood agricultural cycle. We thank God that we still, I'm really hoping that we don't get there. But pork is also backyard. So, the chicken situation is just abysmal at the moment. I mean, and now, of course, there is this big battle that's happening in the WTO where the United States wants to send chicken legs to us, right? I mean, God forbid. And when somebody asked me the question about puberty,
Lollipops, chicken lollipops.
yes, chicken lollipops, and you were asking, you said about not you, somebody else was asking about the puberty issue, like our children attaining, Durga was asking about children attaining puberty earlier. Yes, absolutely. And this is because of the kind of, and both antibiotic and hormonal influences in our meat, and that is, that's a real.
So organic and country chicken is healthier perhaps?
Yes, I mean, nati chicken definitely, no, because it is not pumped up with, at various levels, nati chicken is healthier because one is, of course, you are, the people who are doing this backyard poultry probably cannot afford to, and also they're growing it at a much smaller scale, right? I mean, scale is the big thing here, right? Whether it is meat or milk or vegetables or fruit, the moment you start growing to scale, industrial scale, then you have to mass produce. When you mass produce, you have to maintain uniformity. If you have to maintain uniformity, then it comes down to reducing diversity.
So how do you get the efficiencies of mass production? Do you get it by closing the loop, perhaps, in feeding the manure back to the other animals and using perhaps fish farming also simultaneously?
Exactly. And we have very interesting examples in India itself, right? Where you have this, like, for example, the duck and, when we talk about the duck and paddy farming, like in Kerala, or prawn and rice farming, right? And all over South Asia, actually, and Southeast Asia, right? And which the United Nations has recognized as a heritage, as a global heritage sort of production system. So the whole issue of integrated farming, as Madhu also talking about, where we have where one thing, and the cycle that you mentioned, Nusser, where the output of one is the input of another, so that whole cyclic process. And we talked about it a little bit yesterday when we were talking about the natural cycles and the restoring of cycles. So again, it comes back to uh, recreating those cycles. And it also comes back to the issue of minimizing external inputs. Okay, yeah, that is. That's the point there. So Vignesh, okay, what's a good interval for eating nati chicken? For example, consume once a day, a week, month, year. I am not sure I'm qualified to answer that question. Actually, I'm not sure at all. If anybody else wants to take a shot at it, what's a good? It's again depends. I mean, it's food and eating is such a big function of our culture and our body type and our the point in our life, other health conditions of the body. So if you look at it sort of in a holistic sort of a way, I hate using that word holistic because it's been bandied around so much, but I'm saying if you look at food as a whole, right, Vignesh, if you're sort of if you if, and typically I would say sort of looking at how we ate traditionally, right? I mean, where you have a plate that's got everything in it. Okay, that's got representation from everything in it, right? A classical traditional meal, right, from wherever you are. Yeah? So the eating of any food is a function of your nutritional status as well. So those overconsumption that we were talking about earlier is because those of us who don't need to consume so much are consuming, because again we're driven by the psychology of food. We're driven by what we're being told. We're told that white meat is better than red meat, and who says that, right? And who is sort of telling you this? White meat is better than red meat for whom? I mean, red meat is probably much better for somebody who's nutritionally compromised, because they need the retinol in red meat. They need it for vitamin A production, right? So, I mean, it is so this thing about interval is a very difficult. It's very closely tied uh, to your own health status, to your own, and I would also say to the way you expend your energy, or to your lifestyle, to what you're accustomed to culturally as well. So,
Yeah.
yes,
Since we are talking about food, I mean, I also wanted to turn the discussion towards the politics of food as such. And we
yes,
have seen this vigilante groups coming with arms and trying to, have mob lynching just because somebody is, eating something. So it is none of their business what happens with my platter.
correct,
So
correct.
would you like to make some comments on, the veg and non-veg and the so-called sattvic food versus the,
Yeah,
the Dalit food?
sure, sure,
Uh,
sure. I mean, Naeem, to actually go from your point, a couple of things, right? One that I was referring to when we were laying out the points, that the politics of food around political ideologies, no, which privilege something over the other, right? That's one part of
yeah,
it. Now,
yeah,
when
you
we
did
talk
mention.
about, yeah, but then, we have to go a little deeper into that. And I'm glad you asked this question, because one, of course, is that from a livelihood, social, cultural point of view, how tightly it is linked to somebody's livelihood and life, and therefore food system, right? So this whole thing about lynching and the whole issue of destroying somebody's life and livelihood, that's one level, right? Apart from the fact that it's a criminal act. The other level is the right to food, right? If I expand on the understanding of right to food, it is a human right, right? And it's a fundamental right too, because right to food is very closely linked to the right to life, right?
Yeah,
So if the right to food is linked to the right to life, and if I am being prevented from exercising my right to food for nutritional reasons, cultural reasons, whatever it is, right? So it is a problem at many levels, and so yeah, so that is really, and the politics of food, of course, again it comes back to that issue of power that we were talking about, right? So we have handed over power to somebody to dictate to us, correct? So
yeah,
it's so again coming back to this issue of collectivization, and to sort of address this whole food system in a different way. Do not let somebody dictate what you grow, how you grow, where you grow, under what conditions you grow and eat, right? And so, I mean, and thank you for asking this question and a whole bunch of other questions that everybody else has asked, because it leads us very beautifully to the idea of food sovereignty,
yeah,
control over our food system. And that's what we will talk about much more tomorrow, because that is what will build resilience. Our ability to take control of our own food systems in different ways. All of us may not be able to grow our own food. but how do we engage in the process of production, distribution, consumption? How do we build these connections and networks between ourselves? So, for example, the urban, peri-urban, rural connection, you know, like it's happening in many cities, right? Like, for example, I know friends who in Chennai and in Bangalore, I know friends who live in urban areas, but who volunteer a lot of their time to go out and help whenever possible, whenever required. They have relationships with farmers where they are where during the harvesting season or during the sowing season, when labor is required, and because they have some flexibility in their work environment as well, they're able to go out and actually physically engage. So that those are certain levels of engagement. Other levels of engagement are education, educating our children, educating other people on this whole idea of food. What does what does food mean? Food is a culture. Food is a way of life, right? And to move away from this appropriation of food that has taken place by various power centers, whether it's politicians or agribusiness. Yeah.
Yeah. That's so true.
Yeah. So let me see if we've got any other. Oh yeah, Nusser has got something for Vignesh. Vignesh, so I'm sure you're looking at this, that a recent study was done showing that we eat enough to get about 30% protein, extra carbs to balance that. Vedant, yes, it's sad that hydroponic farming is spreading widely. Do you have some studies that show that vegetables grown in such a way are less nutritious? And why are they less nutritious scientifically? Yes, there is, I mean, a lot of studies have been done on hydroponics, but the hydroponics, there are just so many varieties and there are so many different techniques in hydroponics, right? I mean, in some places, the waste from fish farming is being used in hydroponics. So there is a lot of what do you call it? There's a spectrum of what is called hydroponics. Yeah, and so apart from the nutritional point of view, there is a fundamental problem in not problem, I'd say there's a fundamental question that needs to be raised, right? I mean, where are you doing hydroponics and why are you doing hydroponics, right? Now, water is at such a premium. So therefore, when we talk about using wastewater in the cultivation, treated wastewater, or even grey water in the cultivation of some things through hydroponics, that's one different story. But then when you're talking about using water that is anyway at a premium for hydroponic farming, then that raises a whole host of other questions, right? So it's not just from a nutritional point of view, but it's also from an ecological point of view and from a socio-cultural point of view and from a livelihoods point of view as well. Because hydroponics requires certain infrastructure that is not accessible to many people. And when you start, when you start producing a lot of vegetables or fruit using hydroponic forms of cultivation, then what does it do for us, right? There are a lot of questions that have to be raised when we're talking about something like hydroponics. Madhu has actually some comments on hydroponics as well. Yeah. Sanjay, okay, from the Facebook stream. Okay, Sanjay Gadale, yeah. Is balanced food habit an oxymoron construct in the psychologically driven food consumption in the capitalist society we live in? Well, that's an interesting point. Yeah, when we talk about balanced food habit, right? I mean, and again, Sanjay, what is this balanced food habit, right? I mean, how are we defining balanced food habit? Because if you talk to different people, you will understand balance as different things. You will understand it from purely a nutritional point of view. For others, it's from an ecological point of view. For others, so when we talk about balanced food habit, it's a very it becomes almost a complex question unless we define what it means actually. Yeah. Isn't the main difference between the veg and non-veg food is the amino bond and the nitrogen atom scientifically? Well, not really, because even you're talking about protein, yeah, the protein in pulses, the protein in various other food forms, right? That are not animal based, right? Yes, protein has, in both cases, there's nitrogen and amino bond, but There is a difference also in micronutrients and precursors to food. Okay, so for example, in a lot of vegetarian food, except for some greens and papaya, you do have retinol, but the amount of retinol that is available in meats, say for example in beef or in mutton liver, retinol, which is a precursor to vitamin A, and vitamin A deficiency is a big problem in our country. Okay, so meat also has, from a scientific point of view, if you're looking at, there are a number of micronutrients that are different. There are a number of, there are nutritional differences between the two. And if you're thinking about it scientifically, this is one example. The presence of retinol, the presence of vitamins, vitamin B12, thiamine, niacin, right? So yeah, so there are several other differences if you're looking at it from a scientific point of view. Yeah, and the complexity of the protein and therefore the amino bond in the nitrogen atom, definitely yes.
Yeah. Any more queries, questions, reflections?
And I think we have a comment from Madhu, which is a very, very sort of valid comment here, which is that, if you're interested in, I mean, if you people understand integrated farming, particularly in the traditional system, you have a very, very valid comment from Madhu about this. Yeah, so please go through that. All right, Nusser, I can't wait for tomorrow either, because this discussion is going to get more and more interesting tomorrow. Yes. And I deeply appreciate, thanks a lot, Madhu, for some really insightful comments, which have contributed so much to our discussion and to everybody's understanding as well. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that also calls for the end of this second day.
Yes.
Second day of the night school.
Yes.
This was really, really good. I mean, we thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, and hopefully tomorrow it's going to be the grand finale.
That's right. And tonight I will send you, Naeem, tonight or by tomorrow morning, I'll send you some of these links that people have asked for by email, and then you can sort of put it in there. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll put it to that on the Facebook and also on the events description page. So please check out. Thank you so much, Radha, for this second day session.
Yeah. Thanks all of you. I mean, this was a fantastic, it's really lovely. Thank you for the very vibrant discussion. Yeah, great. See you all tomorrow then. Yeah. All right.
Absolutely.
Good night. Good night.
Yeah.
Good night.
Good night.
Yeah. Thanks, Madhu. Yeah. Bye-bye.